studio this morning. Welcome in. I want to start this morning by saying I hope that everyone had a wonderful 4th of July celebration. If you're watching here live in the United States, we celebrated our, I believe it was, what was it, 247th birthday yesterday. And I know that I'm not supposed to put these kinds of real time remarks into my broadcast, but I just can't help it because that's just real life, right? So, at any rate, I want to start off this morning by just reminding you that what I've been doing here recently in my live broadcast is talking about my recent trip to Israel. And we'll continue to do that this morning. But first of all, I want to apologize for a problem that we had with my last broadcast. It's a little bit comical, really, but what happened was that right here, right below my finger, is my microphone on a stand, and I use that so that the sound quality of my broadcasts will be as good as possible. And so, toward the end of my last broadcast, at about minute 47, I was showing you a picture from my phone, and we'll continue there in just a moment. But as in my zeal to show you a picture from my phone, what happened was that I leaned forward with the camera and my body parts touched the end of the microphone. Well, when you touch the end of the microphone, guess what happens? It mutes the mic. So I apologize for that. And what I'm going to do today to begin is I'm going to start where I muted the mic inadvertently. I'm going to pick up there. And what we were doing at that time was I was showing you a photo here of this tell in the ancient city of Dan. Now, what you see here, and I apologize for all of this. My goodness, where's that? Oh, I know where it's coming from. It's what it's doing is it's mirroring my computer screen. Okay, let's see. All right, you see the ancient gate back there. This is called Abraham's Gate. And in front of it, you have the more modern metal gate, right? And down there in the bottom left-hand corner, what you have is you have the benches that we were sitting on. Okay, so that's your panorama there. All right, so this gate, you all, is 4,000 years old. And you can see they have a canopy over it to protect it because, well, 4,000 years old, right? All right, and the gate was made out of mud and straw. And you think, oh my word, how on earth could something made out of mud and straw endure for 4,000 years, right? I mean, after all, let's consider the story of the three little pigs, and the wolf was able to huff and puff and blow that house down. So how on earth was, if you'll pardon the pun, this able to be preserved for that period of time? Well, over time, it got buried underground, and I'll tell you more about that in just a moment. And now I'm sort of paranoid about this microphone. So if you see me looking down, that's what I'm doing. I'm checking to make sure it's not muted. But okay, so it got buried underground, first of all, and that helped preserve it. But this gate was made out of the same material that the Egyptian pyramids were made out of. So those are still there, right? They've endured floods and, all kinds of other natural disasters, and they still stand. So it's a pretty durable material. Well, what happened was that if you look at this photo right here, okay, do you see those orchards right there? It's a little bit blurry. Do you see the orchards? There's a mountain in the background, and then you have these orchards. Okay, let me tell you why I'm showing you a picture of orchards. It's because in the 1960s, when the Jewish people began to return even more, even faster, even greater to the land of Israel, when they settled in the area of Dan, the very northernmost part of the country, they petitioned the government to let them plant orchards of mango trees and avocado trees, yum yum. And they wanted to do this in order to have an income to sustain the community. So they were using their natural resources to make money to sustain the community. And, when I went to Israel in the past, and even at the beginning of this time, I had heard the word kibbutz, but honestly, I don't know about you, but I really did not know what it meant. So I will tell you more about the concept of a kibbutz when, in our travels together down memory lane for me, we talk about kibbutz Levi. We'll talk about that in a couple of days. So a couple of broadcasts in this case. So at any rate, they petitioned the government. So the government said, yes, plant your orchards, sustain your kibbutz. So they started digging, they started excavating. Well, what do you imagine they ran into as they were excavating for these orchards? Yes, they excavated this ancient gate called Abraham's Gate. And the gate, or one very close to it, is so called because Abraham journeyed through that area when he came from the land of Ur of the Chaldeans into the land of Canaan. Now, of course, Ur of the Chaldeans is in Mesopotamia. So he was journeying from the area northeast of Dan, journeying southwest down into northern Canaan, now northern Israel. All right, so also Abraham, in the battle of the kings against the four kings, chased the enemy all the way to Dan. The scriptures tell us that's quite a good ways. So he definitely could have passed through this gate when he was chasing the enemy kings. And I think this is one of the greatest architectural treasures in the land of Israel. One thing, it's associated with Abraham, and another thing, my goodness, 4,000 years old. And in Psalm 102, we read, my people love their stones. And why? Why do the people love their stones? Because their stones tell their story. So that was the end of our day 3 there in Israel. And now you and I together are going to leap on into the next day, day 4, which is what I was originally going to do with you today, if I hadn't eclipsed by accident the last part of day 3. But I thought that Abraham's Gate was so awesome, I did not want to miss telling you about it. All right, so we got up on day 3, and the air that day, day 4, Arba, that day was quite hazy, and we were told that the haze in the air was a sandstorm. And so, of course, I started thinking about Lawrence of Arabia. I had these memories in my mind of watching these movies from the 1960s, Lawrence of Arabia, and sand was blowing everywhere, and you could barely see, and you could barely breathe, and it looked like a tornado of sand, right? Well, some sandstorms are like that, but this sandstorm wasn't nearly that intense, and it was very widespread. And so because it was so very widespread, it appeared to be just kind of like a haze in the air. So it was interesting. We were able to breathe just fine. But our first thing on the agenda on day 4 was that we were going to climb to the top of a nearby mountain called Mount Arabel. And we had a pretty good hike up that mountain. It was a steady ascent. And when we got up there, we had a beautiful view. But one of the things that struck me at the top of Mount Arabel was that Israel is somewhat, you might say, behind the United States when it comes to protecting humans from their own stupidity. And if you wanted to, at the top of Mount Arabelle, you could walk absolutely to the precipice and throw yourself off. You would never be able to do that in the United States. They would have barricades, they would have fences, they would have all these things to protect you from yourself. All right. But they don't have that up there on the top of Mount Arabelle. And I just thought that was interesting. But from the top of Mount Arabelle, we were able to see the Kinneret, the Sea of Galilee. And I'm going to show you a picture here of Mount Arabelle. And hopefully you can see, if you look in the photo, if you look off to the right, sort of the upper right, you can see a little bit of the Sea of Galilee. And so you see, we could see it pretty well from the top of Mount Arabelle. And that's just part of the view. I'll show you some more in just a moment. But we could also see in the distance, we could see, and I'm sorry for this screen, but if you look in the back there, you can see through the haze. Remember, it's a sandstorm. We could see over into both Jordan and Syria in the background. And the name Kinneret, which is what the Hebrew people call the Sea of Galilee, the Kinneret, the name Kinneret comes from the Hebrew word for harp, because the Sea of Galilee is shaped a little bit like a harp. And if you don't remember that, I'm going to show you. All right, so look up here at the very top of the screen. The bigger sea down toward the bottom is the Dead Sea. But up toward the top, you see the little Sea of Galilee, relatively speaking, and it's shaped a lot like a harp that David might have played during his day. So that's the Kinneret. And the Mount Arabelle was on the north to northeast side of the lake. And that's where the Jewish people lived in Yeshua's day, in Jesus's day. The city of Capernaum is up there. Magdala is up there, where Mary Magdalene was from. And you could see in that photo, you could see Magdala. All right. If you look over toward the right in that photo, you're looking at the modern day city of Magdala. All right. And also the town of Gennesaret. You remember the story of the demoniac of Gennesaret? Well, that's where that city was located. He threw out a legion of demons from that demoniac. And the town of Gennesaret is located between Magdala and Capernaum. And then the city of Tiberias is further to the south down the lake. In fact, when I was in Israel the first time, the first glimpse I ever got of the Kinneret was from the city of Tiberias. But I think I told you last time that in Yeshua's day, Tiberias was a Roman stronghold, so the Jews did not go there. And of course, the town of Tiberias was so named by the Romans to honor one of their emperors, the emperor Tiberius. And we could also see in the distance from the top of Mount Arbel, and you can see this pretty clearly, I think. Do you see those mountains in the distance there? Those are called the horns of Hittim. So if you look at the outer points of that mountaintop, they used to be more pointed, I guess, but they're called the horns of Hittim. And our group took a hike there later on in our trip, and I'll tell you more about that. But directly behind that mountain was the town of Nazareth, the hometown of Yeshua, the town that he grew up in. That is not his ancestral hometown. That was Bethlehem. But Nazareth was the town he grew up in. All right. Back to the horns of Hittim. It was at Passover, Pesach, the year that Yeshua fed the 5,000 at the horns of Hittim. But I'll tell you more about that when we actually get to that point in our trip. Okay, now back to Arabel, right? Arabel is the tell, the mountain above Magdala on the Kinneret, as I've said, and there was a big battle here during the Hasmonean period. Now, to remind you, the Hasmonean period was the first century or two before the birth of Yeshua, all right, and continued on into the period after his birth. So, there was a big battle there, but there were two brothers competing for the Hasmonean throne. One was Hyrcanus II, and the other was Aristobulus. And these two were competing. Hyrcanus II was the son of Alexandra, and he was her pick to ascend to the throne. Well, Herod Antipater was an Edomite. Now, he's a third one. He wasn't one of the brothers. He was a third one. And Herod Antipater was the father of Herod the Great. Herod the Great was hired and installed by the Romans to defeat these two Hasmonean brothers and to usurp the Hasmonean monarchy. So Herod the Great then ascended to the Hasmonean throne, where he ruled for many years. I think he ruled 40 to 50 years. It was quite some time. But at any rate, Mount Arabel was the scene of a very significant battle. Now, there are 350 or so natural caves in the Arabel cliff. People lived at the foot of the mountain as far back as prehistoric times. In 38 BCE, the Jews of Galilee and this guy named Matthias Antigonus, who was the last of the Hasmonean kings, rebelled, seeking independence from the Roman appointed king Herod the Great. Okay, I just mentioned him. One of the rebel strongholds, that is the Jewish strongholds, was at Arabel. To overcome them, Herod lowered his soldiers, his fighters, down from the summit to the caves to fight the rebels who were entrenched there. During the Great Revolt of the Jews, somewhere around 66 CE, so that's about 25 years before this battle I was telling you about, Josephus Flavius, the rebel commander of Galilee, fortified these very same caves. That's why the rebels were able to fend off attackers from these caves. And remember, I told you about Josephus Flavius. Yes, he was the Roman commander. I told you about this when we talked about Gamla in our last broadcast. Josephus Flavius is the famous Josephus that we know as the famous Jewish historian. And after he switched to the Roman side, he described battles in his writings called the Jewish Wars. He wrote a book called The Jewish Wars. And the Battle of Arabel is described in these writings. Okay, so during the Ottoman Empire, now this was during the 1400s CE, so many hundreds of years later, a fortress was built on the cliffs of Arabel. And when we were up there that day, we sat on the remains of that fortress. So remains almost 900 years old. And so those remains can today be clearly seen. Well, back to the Battle of Arabel. The Romans, in their violent crushing of the Jews, had this habit of only destroying communities that were exclusively Jewish. When there were Jews living in larger non-Jewish cities, they were allowed to continue undisturbed, pretty much. And an example of this is the city of Sfat, which we visited the next day in our trip, and which I will tell you about in our next broadcast. It's across the Jordanian plain, and it lies in the upper Galilee Mountains. And we could clearly see the city of Safat while standing on the summit of Arabel. And let me see if I have a picture of that to show you. Here's a picture of the ruins of the fortress, okay, of the Ottomans. And I don't think I have a photo of Safat, or if I do, I'm not seeing it right here. So, sorry about missing out on that one. Okay. All right. But at any rate, I wanted to tell you, I'm going to move on in my journey to tell you about the city of Zipori. And sometimes it's called Sephoris. There's a cosmetic company, which I don't recommend, called Sephora. All right. So it's named after this city. Okay. But Sephoris, or Zipori in the Hebrew, was our next stop for the day. And the name of the city gets its name from the Hebrew word for bird. Zipori is a city at an even higher elevation than the city of Jerusalem. And from Zipori, you could get, I'm apologizing for this in advance, okay, a bird's eye view. I know, that was awful. Okay, so our first stop in Zipori was the ruins of an ancient synagogue. A modern building has been built over those ruins to protect them. And something similar to that was done at Capernaum, but not exactly the same thing, but similar. So we went into this more modern building, and we could see the floor of the ancient structure, and it was a beautiful mosaic. Let me see if I can find you a photo of that to show you. Here's some vegetation in Zipori, beautiful foliage all over Israel. And in the synagogue, here's a picture of the mosaic floor. See how clearly I can get that for you. It's not terribly clear, but it was a beautiful large floor, and they don't encourage walking on that. There was a bar mitzvah, which was going on outside the modern building. You can see people dancing and playing instruments and singing out there. And one of the things we saw on the floor of the mosaic floor was candy. Candy had been thrown all over the floor because at a bar mitzvah, one of the traditions is to throw candy. So we were sitting there listening to information about the beautiful mosaic on the floor. And one of the things, interestingly enough, that was seen in the mosaic floor was a mosaic of the zodiac. And that is rarely seen in Jewish mosaics. But, you know, when the people were taken away into captivity to Babylon, the Babylonians were tremendous astrologers, okay, and astronomers. And sometimes I get those words mixed up. I think astronomer is the one that's more scientific, and astrologer is the one that's more, and sort of occultish. So I think astronomer is the more correct word. But they were great astronomers, all right? And when you read in the Brit Hadashah, the New Testament, about the Magi, well, the Magi were Babylonian Jews who, yes, came from the east, the northeast, the eastern, from Iraq, and they came to Jerusalem, following the big star. And so that's probably why we see a zodiac in the floor of this synagogue is because there was an influence there in Zippori of some Babylonian Jews who studied astronomy and studied the stars. We don't do that so much today, but I'm telling you, I know some scholars, some Bible scholars who are studying the stars and studying the scriptures, and they're finding incredible alignments there. Not from an occult point of view, but they're finding incredible alignments with dates in the scriptures, and showing the scriptures to have actually taken place when they said to have taken place. It's just phenomenal. But I'm getting off on a bit of a rabbit trail. So one of the rabbis on our trip spoke about the history of the Sanhedrin at Zippori. The Sanhedrin met there in Zippori for a time after the diaspora. Now, if you remember, the diaspora, it means dispersion. And in this case, a forced dispersion that took place in 70 CE when the Romans, in the Jewish Roman wars, when the Romans destroyed Jerusalem and when they destroyed the temple. That's when the diaspora took place. And so the Sanhedrin had to flee, and they began to meet in secret. And one of the last places they met was Zippori. And they did some very important things before they left. One of the things that they said and wrote down in their writings and encouraged the people was to build a fence around the Torah. In other words, to protect the integrity of the Torah for future generations. Why? Because the majority of that activity had taken place surrounding the temple via the priesthood. But without a temple, much of the priesthood has lost its purpose, you see, because there's no place to fulfill the mitzvot, the commandments that deal with the temple and the priesthood. So, there's 613 mitzvot in the Torah, right? We can't practice, but I think it's like 270 something of them. I'm not sure of the exact number. I have it somewhere on my iPad, but I'm not going to bother to look it up right now. But it's between 200 and 300 mitzvot that we can even practice today, because many of them have to be practiced in the temple. There is no temple. And furthermore, of those 200 and something, there's even less that people living in the diaspora can practice, because many of those 270 or whatever it is have to be practiced in the land of Israel. So if you're not living in Israel, you can't practice those. So the Sanhedrin was encouraging people of future generations to build a fence around the Torah. Thank goodness they did, because it helped to preserve the scriptures for us today. Hallelujah. Praise Father Yah. And then another thing was to make no hasty judgments, And this is one of the reasons why people who practice Orthodox Judaism, they view the Torah as being open to interpretation, even today. And then their final act as a Sanhedrin was to create a perpetual Jewish calendar. You see, in the days of the temple, the calendar had been created essentially month to month. And there was a very elaborate process, which I'm not going to go into right now, which enabled the high priest to declare when the first day of the next lunar month, Rosh Chodesh, was going to be. And then the Sanhedrin would ratify that day as the first day of the month. And it was very important that everyone was on the same page about that in the Jewish practicing world, because that determined when the festivals and other important celebrations were going to be. So that was a very elaborate process. Well, again, with no temple, how do you establish the first day of the month? There was no way to do it. Therefore, the Sanhedrin, as its final act, was to establish a perpetual calendar. And the entire Jewish world today almost follows the same perpetual Jewish calendar. Now, I have a friend who has studied the stars. And with our software, we can go back centuries. We can see what the sky, you name a date, thousands of years ago, far back further than the last act of the Sanhedrin, back to even the year that Yeshua was born. And this software can tell you without error what the stars looked like. This software can tell you when the first new moon was of every month. And this friend of mine, this incredible scholar, has created another calendar, which I believe to be more accurate than the perpetual Jewish calendar. But of course, in order for it to become kosher, it has to be approved by a Sanhedrin, and an approved Sanhedrin, not just some rogue Sanhedrin declaring we're the Sanhedrin, and there is no such right now widely accepted Sanhedrin. But on the day that one is formed, I hope he'll get to stand before them and present his evidence for his calendar. All right. I'm badly rabbit trailing today, people. All right, going on. So they created this perpetual Jewish calendar, and they were also working on resolving the issue of there being one day of a festival in Israel and two in the Galut, which Galut means rest of the world. They were also dealing with the use of tefillin, those leather straps, which Jewish men wrap around their forearms each day to say their prayers, and consistent performing of that Torah commandment, because there was some inconsistency. They were also working on issues surrounding the get. If you don't know what the get is, that's the Hebrew word for a writ of divorce. There was some issues with that, people not wanting to give women the get and women withholding sexual relations as a result, and so on and so forth. It was a messy issue. But before these hanging Chad type of issues could be firmly established, the persecution of the Jews got so great that the Sanhedrin was scattered to the four corners of the earth. What the Romans did was they said to all these little towns, for a little while, the Sanhedrin would meet in one place, and when it got too hot there, they would flee to another. And then the Romans would discover them there, and they'd run them out, and they'd flee to another. And the Romans got tired of chasing the Sanhedrin, because as we know, our people, the Jewish people, can be quite persistent, especially when it comes to matters of faith. Hallelujah. But they said, the Romans, they said, okay, you little towns and burgs, here's what we're going to do. If you are found to be harboring this band of misfits, as the Jews were viewed by the Romans, if you're found to be harboring the Sanhedrin, we are going to come in and we are going to burn your town to the ground and kill everyone in it. Well, that was quite an exceedingly off-putting threat, wasn't it? And so none of the little towns were willing to allow the Sanhedrin to meet there. And that's why they were scattered to the four corners of the earth. Well, Dipori had been the foremost center of Jewish learning in northern Israel for hundreds of years. Now get this. Yeshua and his cousin, John the Baptist, were from priestly families. John was a Levite. Yeshua's mother, Mary, was from a Levitical family, and we know this because her cousin Elizabeth was married to a priest. Well, priests always married Levite women. Now, Levite women didn't always marry Levite men, but Levitical priests always married Levite women, women from the tribe of Levi. So if Elizabeth was from the tribe of Levi and she and Mary were cousins, that means that Mary was from a Levitical family. So Zippori was where Yeshua would have been sent to Hebrew school as a boy. Yes, of course he went to Hebrew school. Are you kidding me? And Zippori is within walking distance of Nazareth. Now, granted, it's a good hike, up a mountain, down a mountain, across a plain, but it's where Yeshua would have gone to Hebrew school. And by the way, I want you to know that Hebrew was the religious language of Yeshua's day. It was the language of Jewish government and Jewish faith. But the common tongue that the common people spoke in Yeshua's day was Aramaic. Aramaic. Now, where did Aramaic come from? Well, Aramaic came from Babylon and from Assyria. And you're like, why are they speaking that? Well, because the 10 northern tribes were conquered by Assyria and carted off to Assyria, and they began to speak Aramaic. And then when Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians conquered Judah, the remaining tribes of Judah, Benjamin, and Levi, and hauled them off to Babylon, Aramaic was spoken there. So in those 70 years, the Jews began to speak Aramaic. And when, in both cases, Jewish people returned to Canaan, to the land, the promised land, they brought the speaking of Aramaic with them. Now, Aramaic is what you might call a close cousin of Hebrew. They're very closely related, but they're two separate languages. All right. So the common people, Yeshua and his 12 disciples, they would have spoken Aramaic to each other, right? And we have very, very early manuscripts of the Brit Chadashah, the New Testament, in the Aramaic language. All right. Gina, stop rabbit trailing. All right. So Nazareth was less than 3 miles away from Zippori. So, for a young man, it would have been an easy walk. And you can see that all of these little towns in that area of Galilee were close together. Now, after the Romans came to Zippori at the end of the 1st century CE, they built a theater because the Romans built a theater in every major Roman city. I'm going to see if I can find a picture of this theater. Oh, here's a better picture of the mosaic floor. And those are lights shining on it. Can you see it? It's, it's not the best, right? But that was the floor of that synagogue. Here's another good photo. I don't know why I didn't show you these earlier, right? See it close up? Yeah. The lights are a bit off-putting, aren't they? Beautiful, beautiful mosaics. All right, here is a photo of the theater there at Zippori, and they've got some kind of structure, metal structure built there on the stage because they still have performances there, right? You can see the seats in the background. Okay, so you're looking at the sort of a side view, and you can see the seats. I'm going to be careful not to turn off my mic, but you can see the seats back there in the background. Let's see if I have a better picture. Ah, yes, I do. There's a photo of the seats. And what I want to tell you is back there in the back of that photo, that is the older original theater from the Roman times. And there in the foreground where you see people sitting, that is a newer restored section. Okay. So the theater there in Zippori had 4,500 seats, and they presented lighthearted performances there, such as pantomime, clown shows, social satire. The Jewish sages of that day believed the theater symbolized both Rome and its hedonistic culture. And so, therefore, they forbade their followers from attending it. Now, there was also a fortress at Zippori, and it is located at the top of the hill overlooking the entire area. And it's no surprise that the inhabitants of Zippori throughout its history renovated the fortress. And when archaeologists in modern times began to once again be interested in the area, the fortress was the only structure that stood out. Um, and it was the surface that stood out intact before archaeological excavations began. So it was probably the most well preserved structure there, probably because it had been built so many times. There was also the ruins of a private residence there at Zippori called the Dionysius House. Now, if you remember, Dionysius was one of the Roman gods, and this was a very interesting home. It was the home of a very wealthy person, and we know that because the house was on the summit. And if any structure on the summit is an indication of wealth. So the mosaic in the floor pictured the pagan drunken orgy known as Saturnalia. And over 1.5 million stones were used to construct this mosaic, this floor mosaic. Wow. Conquering a country in those days also meant denigrating their gods, in a sense, conquering their gods. And the goddess Mene is a goddess who preceded the Roman goddess Mithros. The birthday of Mithros, who was the sun god of the Persians, was believed to be December 25th. I'll let you ruminate on that a little bit on the Roman calendar. This luxurious home even had an elaborate mosaic in the nearby toilet room, which we could still see. One of the mosaics in the floor is nicknamed the Mona Lisa of Israel. How about that? And the central mosaic in the floor pictures the two demigods, Dionysius and Bacchus, who are having, guess what? A drinking contest. Yeah, because the festival of Saturnalia featured drinking. Let me see if I can show you some pictures. All right, now, this is not real clear, probably. We'll see how it goes. All right, this is a picture of the floor mosaic. All right, there's the bottom. I'm going to kind of move through it. And can you see the two demigods there in the center having the drinking contest? I would point to them, but I'm afraid I would mute my mic. And then down here at the bottom, I'll show you a better picture of her in a minute. There's the face of the Mona Lisa of Israel. Can you see her? If not, I'll show you a better picture. Okay. All right. Let me enlarge this a little bit. All right. Here's an enlargement. See her? Isn't she beautiful? The Mona Lisa of Israel. And I probably got a better picture, but she's down at the bottom of the mosaic. Okay. And it's a big floor. It was a very, very wealthy person. Okay. So I don't know if you know this or not, but in the inner courtyards of the Jewish temples, there was no wine drinking allowed. Now, I didn't say there was no wine, because you may know that in the altar sacrifices, wine was featured. You always gave a wine offering, an oblation, right? A wine, am I saying that word? Abulation maybe is what it is. My vocabulary is failing me, which doesn't happen very often, but this time it did. Okay, so we know for sure that the Dionysius house was definitely not owned or inhabited by Jews. It was inhabited by some wealthy Romans. Okay. Now there was another house there, another wealthy home, this one from the 3rd century CE. And in the center of this house, in the floor of what was believed to have been the dining room, there was a mosaic featuring Orpheus. Now, Orpheus was the god of music, and Orpheus was playing music to wild animals in this particular mosaic. Opposite the great bathhouse in the marketplace stood one of the most important structures in the city, a public house that was built in the 5th century CE. And that it may have been something like City Hall. And that building featured a main hall and several rooms, and they were all adorned with spectacular mosaics in the floor. And in this same structure, we saw 2 more fascinating mosaic floors. And one of them is a mosaic of something called the Amazon women. Here's another photo of the Mona Lisa. So pretty. Okay, let me see if I can find this mosaic of the Amazon women. Okay, I don't know if you're going to be able to see much of this or not. I'm going to close up on one of them. Okay, there are these 2 Amazon women, and they're on horseback. Now, I want you to look at this woman. Oh, I'm so sorry. Wow, I apologize. That probably was, give someone some sort of major coronary. I apologize. All right, now look, I need to hold on to my phone more carefully. In this photo, do you see this woman? All right, she is a warrior. Do you see her arm? That is her right arm. Where is her left arm? Okay. Can you see it? She's holding a shield. All right. Now, there's an interesting factoid about these Amazon women. It's kind of gross. All right. Let me broaden out a little bit. Here's the other one. They're on 2 facing horses. Can you see them? They're on 2 facing horses. And it is said that the 2 Amazon women pictured here and other warrior women like them would cut off their right breast in order to draw the bow more easily, right? Pull back on the string, draw the bow more easily. Yet on this mosaic, no mutilation was visible, but that's what the legend is. The origin of the word Amazon lies in the Greek word matos, which means breast. How interesting. All right. So the last mosaic we saw in this house and in Zipori was the Nilometer mosaic. It featured a measuring rod type of tool to measure the depth of the Nile River in Egypt. And you're like, well, who cares about that? Well, let me tell you why it's important. Of course, this was a highly agricultural society, and the level of the Nile River would predict drought, famine, and death. If an area had a famine, the people would migrate somewhere else, and that would upset the delicate cultural balance in other areas. So the depth of the Nile was very important. So they had a Nilometer, as we call it in English. But this was the living room floor of another wealthy person. Maybe it was the governor's mansion. Maybe the governor lived in this public building. But at any rate, so many beautiful mosaic floors in that structure, an indication of tremendous wealth. Well, by this time it was lunchtime and we were hot. It was a hot day and we were tired. But I want to show you one more thing before we leave Zipori. Some of the people on our tour were demonstrating. Let me see if I can turn this sideways. We're demonstrating what it was like in a chariot, in an Egyptian chariot, a Roman chariot. All right. You had, of course, horses pulling the chariot, and that's what the people in the front are doing. But the people in the back are demonstrating that each chariot had 3 people in it. You had the person holding the reins of the horses. you had the person with the bow and arrow shooting the bows and arrows, and then you had the person in the back who was called the seatbelt. The seatbelt leaned back and held on to the other two people to keep them from falling out of the chariot backward, right? The seatbelt. I imagine the seatbelt's arms must have gotten very tired. All right. So after lunch, we went down to the sea, the Kinneret, and we rode on something that is commonly called the Jesus boat. Now, I don't know how I could have gone to Israel twice before and not having ridden on the Jesus boat on the Sea of Galilee, because that seems to be something that a lot of followers of Yeshua do. Okay. So we did that and we had a great time. But there is also an artifact there in that town that is called the Jesus boat. All right. So you can ride in a boat that's a recreation on the Sea of Galilee, but there's an actual artifact that is called the Jesus boat. And it's because it was found buried in the mud of the Sea of Galilee. And as Father Yah would have it, it was preserved for over 1900 years. Hallelujah. All right. So during a severe drought in Israel in the 1980s, two fishermen discovered this boat buried in the mud and the silt of the Kinneret. And the Kinneret, by the way, is 5 miles wide and 17 miles long. And it took about 9 years to complete the treatment and restoration of this boat. They had to be very careful, obviously. And when you see it today, I may have a picture of it. I'll be looking while I'm telling you about it. When you see it today, it's almost completely black. All right. Here's a photo. And you can see people in the background. So this gives you an idea of the scale of the boat. It's pretty big, pretty good size, right? Yeah, not just a little rowboat, right? And those things up on those silver white looking things looking up on the side, those aren't part of the boat. They are supports to keep it from falling apart. All right. Okay. So it took about 9 years to complete the restoration of this boat. Checking my sound again. So in order to move the boat from the waters of the Kinneret onto land, the restorers used a polyurethane foam coating, and it surrounded the boat inside and out. Okay. It surrounded it inside and out. And once the boat was floated on the lake for the first time in nearly 2,000 years, it was lifted by a crane to a work area destination inside the museum. And next, the conservationists took samples of the different types of wood for identification and analysis. And interestingly, there were several different types of wood in the construction of this boat. There was Christ thorn, carob, Aleppo pine, hawthorn cedar, tabor of sycamore, laurel willow, Judas tree, and others. The boat is made mostly of oak and cedar, however. Possible damage from worms or bacteria that were present before the restoration process continued was controlled by the hearty appetite of the St. Peter's fish that they brought in specifically for the purpose of getting rid of this bacteria. So they submerged the boat, they resubmerged it in water, and they brought these fish in, these St. Peter's fish, and the St. Peter's fish ate the bacteria off of the boat. Isn't that amazing? And then they also used 65 tons of chemicals in their meticulous calculations over a period of 9 years to enable the wood to dry out for the first time in 2,000 years. And the result is that an authentic first century fishing boat was revealed. And that model is now placed in the museum where I showed you the picture. One of our rabbis recommended a couple of articles by someone named Mendel Nun, Mendel-Nun, first and last name, Mendel Nun. He wrote very well about the Kinneret. But by this time, it was after 5 p.m. local time, and we headed back to the kibbutz for dinner and had a wonderful rest of our evening. So that ends our day 4 of our journeys in Israel. And I hope you're at least learning some new things as I share with you about my travels. We have several more days to go, and I'm enjoying reliving this with you. I hope you're making some notes so that when it's your turn to either go to the land or return to the land, you will make note of this and want to visit some of these places. I'll tell you, the best way to go is to hire your own tour guide and to book your own room, to book your own flight, and to see the country that way, because you can customize it to see whatever you want. If you're not a hiker, you can arrange it to where you barely step foot out of the car. If you are a hiker, you can schedule hikes. The ones we went on were not overly rigorous. We had a gentleman, 85 years old, in our party who went on hikes and did every single hike in the trip. I can't even say that. Okay, the heat got to me a couple of days, and I was like, no, it's just too hot to go hiking. And so you can customize your trip however you want it. Okay, remember, you can find the written text of my remarks at resplendentdaughter.blogspot.com, and you will find them posted on Thursday, June 8th, day 4. You can also watch this video for the next 6 days here at messianiclambradio.com. Just look for me under Wednesday at 11 o'clock. That's where all my videos here on Messianic Lamb Network live. And if you want to catch up, you missed a day and the week is gone, you can find all my videos on my YouTube channel. My name, Gina Hood, GENAHOOD, 2818. I also have a Facebook page, Resplendent Daughter Ministries. Please go like and follow it if you will. And I guess that's all I have for you today. So we will see you back next week. Thank you so much for tuning in here at Mishkan, Katan.
We are richly blessed to bring you what we believe is the fullest, most diverse, yet up-to-date progressive teachings, discussion, and prayer programming you can find anywhere on this planet. Be sure to take the tour of the MessianicLambRadio.com website. I'm Susan Hoogie, thanking you for joining us on the Messianic Lamb Video Network.